Most empaths spend their lives trying to manage their sensitivity, trying to protect themselves from absorbing too much, trying to figure out where they end and other people begin. They read books about boundaries, they learn to say no, they meditate, they journal, they distance themselves from toxic people. And all of that matters, but none of it is the final destination. Carl Jung mapped a stage of development so far beyond ordinary empathic experience that most empaths don't even know it exists. He connected it to one of the oldest archetypes in human consciousness, Sophia, the archetype of wisdom itself. Jung outlined 4 stages of what he called anima development, the evolution of the inner feminine principle that exists in every psyche regardless of gender. The first stage, Eve, is purely biological, instinctive, survival-driven. The second, Helen, is romantic and aesthetic, the idealization of beauty and desire. The third, Mary, is devotional and spiritual, purity, sacrifice, saintliness. Most empaths who've done serious inner work reach somewhere around this third stage. They've refined their sensitivity into something spiritual. They've learned to hold space. They've become healers, caregivers, the ones everyone calls when the world falls apart. But the fourth stage, Sophia, is something else entirely. Sophia isn't about feeling more deeply or helping more selflessly. Sophia is wisdom that has been forged in the furnace of everything the empath has survived, absorbed, lost, and finally released. It's what happens when an empath stops being a wound that walks through the world feeling everything and becomes a quiet intelligence that sees through everything. Today, I'm going to walk you through the 8 signs that an empath has crossed into the Sophia stage. These aren't personality traits you can fake or spiritual performances you can adopt. They're fundamental shifts in how consciousness operates. And if you're experiencing them, something has changed in you that can never be reversed. The first sign an empath has reached the Sophia stage is that they've stopped trying to be understood and started becoming the one who understands. This shift is so subtle that it can happen before the empath fully registers what's changed. For years, sometimes decades, the empathic experience centers around a desperate need to be seen, to have someone finally grasp what it's like to walk through the world feeling everything at full volume. The empath explains themselves endlessly. They try different words, different frameworks, different analogies. They show people articles about empaths. They seek out other sensitives who might get it. And underneath all of this effort is a wound that says, if no one understands me, maybe I'm not real. The Sophia stage dissolves that need, not by giving up on connection or deciding that isolation is acceptable. Something more fundamental happens. The empath's center of gravity shifts. They stop orienting their entire inner life around whether they're being perceived accurately by others. They begin perceiving others with a depth and clarity that makes the old need for mutual understanding seem almost quaint. Jung recognized this as a hallmark of genuine psychological maturity. He observed that patients who reached this level stopped performing their inner world for external validation. They didn't need you to understand their experience because they were too busy understanding yours. Not in a codependent, self-erasing way. In the way a river doesn't need the landscape to validate its current. It just moves. It shapes the terrain by being what it is, not by explaining what it is. If you've noticed that the ache of being misunderstood has quietly faded, not because someone finally understood you, but because the need itself dissolved, that's not indifference. That's Sophia beginning to operate. The empath who reaches this stage still values deep connection, still craves intimacy and truth between people. But they've stopped requiring understanding as proof of their own existence. They've become self-validating in a way that frees enormous amounts of energy that used to be spent on translation. And here's what makes this sign unmistakable. Other people start seeking out the empath not for comfort or healing, but for understanding. People begin arriving in their life saying things like, "You're the only person who actually gets what I'm going through." Not because the empath is performing empathy, because the empath's field of perception has become so refined that people feel genuinely known in their presence. That's not a skill. That's Sophia working through the empath's psychology. The second sign is that their compassion has become selective rather than universal. This one disturbs people who associate empathy with unconditional warmth. For most of an empath's life, compassion operates like a faucet stuck in the open position. They feel for everyone: the stranger on the bus, the coworker who just seems off today, the friend of a friend going through something, the abusive parent who must be carrying their own pain, the narcissist who's clearly wounded underneath the cruelty. Compassion pours out toward everything that suffers, without discrimination, without limit. The Sophia stage introduces something that feels almost heretical to an empath who's built their identity around universal compassion: discernment. Their heart doesn't close, it focuses. They begin recognizing that undirected compassion isn't wisdom, it's a hemorrhage. And genuine wisdom requires choosing where to pour your understanding with the same care a surgeon chooses where to cut. Jung would have saw this as the integration of what he called the thinking function with the feeling function. Empaths are dominated by feeling, by the raw, immediate experience of emotional information. But Sophia represents feeling that has been infused with intelligence. It's compassion that can see 3 moves ahead, compassion that recognizes when it's being exploited, compassion that knows the difference between someone who's suffering and someone who's performing suffering to manipulate. The empath at the Sophia stage can sit across from someone in genuine pain and feel that pain fully, then choose not to intervene. Not because they don't care, because they can see that intervention would actually prevent the other person from reaching something they need to reach alone. They can perceive suffering without being enslaved by the impulse to fix it. They can witness darkness without needing to light a candle every single time. This looks cold to people who knew the empath before the shift. Where did all that warmth go? Why aren't you helping? Why didn't you rush in when you saw someone struggling? The empath hears these questions and feels the weight of them. But something in them has settled into a deeper knowing. They can see now that much of their earlier compassion was compulsive rather than conscious. It was a trauma response wearing the mask of virtue. It was a child who learned that being needed was the only way to be safe, projecting that pattern onto every suffering person they encountered. Sophia stage compassion is quieter, more devastating in its accuracy, and far, far more effective because it's chosen rather than automatic. The third sign is that they've started seeing patterns as architecture rather than personal attacks. This might be the most liberating shift the empath experiences. Before the Sophia stage, empaths live in a world that feels personally hostile. When someone lies to them, it feels like a betrayal aimed at them specifically. When a relationship turns toxic, it feels like punishment. When a system fails them, it feels intentional. Every wound is personal. Every pattern is about them. The Sophia stage dissolves the personal and reveals the structural. The empath begins perceiving human behavior not as individual choices made to hurt or help, but as patterns running through people. Patterns that have been running long before the empath entered the picture and will keep running long after. They see the narcissist not as someone choosing to be cruel, but as someone trapped in an architecture of shame so complete that cruelty is the only behavior the structure can produce. They see the abandoner not as someone who chose to leave, but as someone whose avoidant attachment pattern made leaving the only move their nervous system could execute. Jung spent much of his career mapping these psychological architectures, the complexes, the archetypes, the inherited patterns that move through human behavior like currents through water. Most people experience these patterns personally. They feel attacked by them, wounded by them, confused by them. The Sophia stage empath sees them operating and recognizes what they're looking at. This doesn't mean they stop feeling pain when patterns affect them. A pattern doesn't hurt less because you understand its architecture. But the meaning changes completely. The empath stops asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and starts recognizing, "This is what this pattern does. This is how it moves through people, and I'm watching it do what it always does." The shift from personal to structural is the shift from suffering to understanding. And that understanding, that capacity to see the pattern beneath the behavior, is pure Sophia. There's a specific moment when this shift becomes undeniable. Someone hurts the empath, and instead of the usual cascade of pain, confusion, and self-blame, the empath watches themselves think, "I see what just happened. I see the wound that produced that behavior. I see the pattern completing itself, and I see exactly where this is going." The pain is still present, but it's surrounded by comprehension so complete that it can't consume them the way it used to. This capacity to see architecturally rather than personally was one of the rarest forms of human intelligence. Most people never develop it because it requires having been wounded enough to understand patterns, healed enough to stop being blinded by the wounds, and wise enough to perceive the structure operating behind both the wounding and the healing. The fourth sign is that silence has become their primary language. Empaths talk, or at least empaths before the Sophia stage talk. They process out loud. They explain what they're sensing. They describe what they're feeling. They warn people about patterns they've detected. They name dynamics that nobody asked them to name. Their sensitivity produces a constant stream of verbal output because the inner experience is so overwhelming that it demands expression. The Sophia stage empath goes quiet, not withdrawn, not sullen, not withholding. Quiet in the way a deep lake is quiet. Enormous amounts happening beneath the surface, almost nothing visible on top. This silence isn't suppression. They haven't learned to swallow their perceptions to make others comfortable. What's happened is that their perception has become so layered, so fast, so comprehensive, that language can no longer keep up with what they're seeing. Trying to translate their awareness into words starts feeling like trying to describe a symphony by listing the individual notes. Technically possible, completely missing the point. Jung recognized that the highest forms of knowing often operated beyond language. He wrote extensively about how the unconscious communicated through symbols, images, dreams, channels that bypass the limitations of verbal thought. The Sophia stage represents the empath's consciousness making a similar leap. Their understanding has become so integrated, so immediate, that it no longer needs to be mediated through words to be real. Other people experience this silence as intensity. They sit with the Sophia stage empath and feel seen in a way that has nothing to do with what's being said. Because what's happening isn't conversation, it's transmission. The empath's understanding radiates through their presence, their attention, the quality of their listening. They don't need to tell you what they see, you feel it. And here's the part that surprises the empath themselves. When they do speak from this place of silence, the words carry weight that their earlier, more voluminous communication never had. A single sentence from a Sophia stage empath can reorganize someone's entire understanding of themselves. Because the sentence isn't coming from the intellect scrambling to translate a feeling. It's coming from a deep reservoir of integrated knowing, surfacing at exactly the right moment, carrying exactly the right truth. If you've noticed that you've become drastically more quiet, not because you're tired or disconnected, but because something in you has stopped needing to narrate your inner experience, pay attention. That silence is Sophia settling into your consciousness like sediment settling in still water. The clarity that follows is unlike anything the talking mind can produce. If you're recognizing these shifts in yourself and looking for a way to go deeper, our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, designed to meet you exactly where this kind of inner transformation is already happening. It's less about learning new concepts and more about giving structure to the knowing that's already emerging in you. Click below to get True Self-Discovery, and let's keep going. The fifth sign is that they've lost interest in being right. For most of an empath's life, being right feels like survival. They perceive things others don't see. They sense dynamics nobody acknowledges. They detect lies, recognize patterns, feel shifts in energy that are invisible to everyone around them. And because their perceptions are so often dismissed, you're too sensitive, you're imagining things, you're overreacting. Proving their perceptions correct becomes existentially important. If I can prove I was right, then my perception is valid. If my perception is valid, then I'm not crazy. If I'm not crazy, then I'm allowed to exist. The Sophia stage breaks this chain completely. Not because the empath's perceptions become less accurate, they become more accurate than ever. But the need to prove that accuracy, to be validated, confirmed, acknowledged as the one who saw it first, evaporates. And what replaces it is something far more unsettling to the people around them. Indifference. Not about truth itself, about being recognized as truth's source. Jung observed a version of this in patients who'd reached the later stages of individuation. They'd arrive at insights that would have produced enormous satisfaction earlier in their development, being right about someone's character, predicting how a situation would unfold, seeing a pattern before it manifested. And instead of triumph, they'd feel something closer to weariness. Not because the insights were less valuable, because the ego gratification of "I was right" had become transparent to them. They could see their own need to be right as just another pattern, a defense mechanism left over from childhood, when being accurate was the only way to stay safe. The Sophia stage empath lets observations sit without needing them acknowledged. They perceive where a relationship is heading and say nothing. They recognize someone's self-deception and don't point it out. They watch a situation deteriorating and don't position themselves as the prophet who warned everyone. They just know, and they act on what they know. And they let others reach their own understanding on their own timeline. This is profoundly different from the empath who bites their tongue while screaming internally. That empath is suppressing. The Sophia stage empath isn't suppressing anything. The need has genuinely dissolved. Being right has been replaced by something much more interesting to them. Being aligned. Aligned with their own knowing. Aligned with reality as it actually is. Aligned with the pattern of their life as it unfolds. Whether anyone else sees what they see has become irrelevant. Not because they've given up on people, because they've stopped outsourcing their sanity to other people's perception. The sixth sign is that they've begun grieving forward, mourning what hasn't happened yet, and finding peace in that mourning. This is the sign that most clearly separates the Sophia stage from every stage before it. Ordinary grief looks backward. You lose something and you mourn its absence. The relationship ended. The person died. The dream collapsed. Standard empathic grief amplifies this. The empath doesn't just mourn their own losses, but absorbs the grief of everyone around them, carrying sorrows that don't belong to them. Sophia stage grief operates in a direction most people can't comprehend. The empath begins mourning things that haven't happened yet. They sit across from someone they love and feel the grief of the eventual separation. Not with anxiety, not with dread, but with a vast, quiet acceptance that everything they cherish is already in the process of passing. They look at their own life and feel tenderness toward the self they haven't yet become, mourning the version of themselves that's dissolving right now to make room for what's next. Jung understood this as the psyche's relationship with impermanence at its most mature. He explored how the unconscious existed outside of linear time, how dreams could mourn futures that hadn't arrived, how archetypes carried grief that belonged to no specific event but to the human condition itself. The Sophia archetype sits at the intersection of wisdom and sorrow. Not the sharp sorrow of loss, but the deep, ancient sorrow of seeing clearly how temporary everything is and loving it fiercely anyway. The empath at this stage doesn't try to prevent loss, doesn't cling harder because they can feel the impermanence, doesn't distance themselves to preemptively protect against pain. They hold everything, the beauty and the passing of the beauty, simultaneously. They sit in a room full of people they love and feel both the warmth of that love and the eventual absence of it. And instead of being destroyed by the contradiction, they're deepened by it. This is the grief that mystics and philosophers have tried to describe for thousands of years. It's not depression. It's not pessimism. It's the precise opposite. It's love so complete that it includes the loss. Jung would have called this the reconciliation of opposites, one of the central achievements of individuation. The Sophia stage empath doesn't split reality into good and bad, into presence and absence, into love and grief. They hold them together. And what emerges from that holding is a quality of aliveness that people without this capacity find both beautiful and slightly terrifying to be around. If you found yourself tearing up not because something sad happened, but because you can feel the whole arc of something, its beginning, its fullness, its inevitable ending, all at once, that's forward grief. That's Sophia seeing through time the way other empaths see through social performance. The seventh sign is that their presence has started changing rooms without them saying a word. Empaths have always affected the energy of spaces they enter. That's been true since childhood. But the pre-Sophia empath typically affects spaces by absorbing. They walk in, soak up whatever emotional weather is present, and either reflect it back amplified or collapse under its weight. The space changes because the empath is reacting to it so visibly that other people have to respond to the empath's reaction. The Sophia stage empath affects rooms differently. They walk in and something settles, not because they're projecting calm, not because they're performing groundedness. Something about the density of their presence, the sheer weight of integrated experience behind their awareness, creates a gravitational effect. Conversations become more honest. People drop pretenses they didn't know they were holding. Arguments lose their momentum. The energy in the room reorganizes itself around the empath's presence the way iron filings reorganize around a magnet. Jung explored this phenomenon through his concept of the mana personality, the individual whose inner development creates a kind of psychic authority that others respond to unconsciously. But the mana personality, as Jung warned, can become inflated. The person mistakes the effect they have on others for personal power and develops a messiah complex. The Sophia stage empath avoids this trap because they're not trying to have this effect. They're often the last person in the room to recognize that their presence is doing anything. They just showed up. They just sat down. They just listened. What's actually happening is that the Sophia stage empath has integrated so much of their own shadow, processed so much of their own pain, released so many of the patterns that used to drive their behavior, that their psyche has become remarkably still. And stillness, in a world full of psychological noise, is profoundly disruptive. People in the presence of genuine psychological stillness find their own noise becoming audible. Their defenses feel more obvious. Their performances seem more transparent, not because the empath is pointing anything out, because the contrast between the empath's integration and the other person's fragmentation becomes impossible to ignore. This is why some people feel deeply comforted by the Sophia stage empath's presence, while others feel inexplicably agitated. The comforted ones are ready to see what the stillness reveals. The agitated ones are not. Both responses are valid. Both are created by the same source, a presence so psychologically honest that dishonesty can't maintain itself nearby. If people have started telling you that something about you feels different, not what you're saying or doing, but something they can't quite name about being around you, and if you've noticed that your mere presence seems to shift the quality of interactions in ways you're not intentionally engineering, that's not imagination. That's the gravitational effect of integrated consciousness. That's Sophia, working through your presence the way light works through a window. You're not generating the light, you're just no longer obstructing it. The eighth sign, and the one Jung would have considered the most significant, is that they've stopped healing and started knowing. This requires careful distinction because the words sound similar to spiritual bypassing. When someone declares they're beyond healing, it usually means they've found a clever way to avoid doing the work. That's not what this is. The Sophia stage empath has done the work, years of it, decades often. They've faced their shadow, they've grieved their wounds, they've dismantled the survival mechanisms that once protected them. They've gone to the bottom of their pain and sat with it until it released them. The healing has been so thorough, so honest, so complete that there's nothing left to heal. Not because they're perfect, because they've stopped being at war with their own psychology. What replaces healing is something for which Jung used the Greek term gnosis, direct knowing. Not knowledge acquired through study, not insight gained through analysis. A knowing that operates through the body, through felt sense, through a kind of immediate perception that doesn't need evidence or reasoning to be certain. The Sophia stage empath doesn't figure things out anymore. They know them. Not arrogantly, not performatively, the way you know your own name. It's just there, present, undeniable. Jung spent significant portions of his career studying this kind of knowing, the way certain patients moved from intellectual understanding of their patterns to embodied, cellular-level recognition that changed how they walked through the world. He connected it to the Sophia archetype specifically because wisdom, in its oldest and deepest formulation, isn't about accumulating information. It's about becoming the kind of consciousness through which truth can pass without distortion. The wise person doesn't possess truth. They've become transparent to it. For the empath, this transition from healing to knowing manifests in specific ways. They stop analyzing people and start recognizing them. Someone walks into their awareness and the empath doesn't need to process, read energy, decode behavior. They simply know who they're looking at. The pattern, the wound, the defense, the potential. It all arrives simultaneously, not as data to be assembled, but as a complete picture that presents itself whole. They stop processing their own emotional reactions and start receiving information through them. An emotion arises, grief, anger, unease, and instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" or "Whose feeling is this?" the Sophia stage empath recognizes the emotion as intelligence. The grief is telling them something specific. The anger is pointing at something true. The unease is registering a pattern their conscious mind hasn't caught up with yet. Emotions have become a perception organ rather than a psychological problem to manage. They stop trying to figure out the right thing to do and start recognizing what's already moving through them. Decisions become less about deliberation and more about alignment. The Sophia stage empath doesn't weigh pros and cons. They feel into the field of possibility around a choice and recognize which direction carries the quality of truth. Then they move. Not blindly, not impulsively, with the kind of grounded certainty that comes from decades of learning to trust their perception after decades of being told that perception was invalid. Jung would have recognized this as the self beginning to operate through the ego rather than being obstructed by it. In his framework, the self is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, personal and collective, individual and archetypal. The ego is the small center of awareness that usually believes it's running the show. When the self begins directing, the individual experiences a quality of knowing that feels both deeply personal and larger than personal simultaneously. They're not thinking their way to wisdom. Wisdom is thinking through them. This is the final sign because it contains all the others. The empath who has stopped healing and started knowing has already stopped needing to be understood because their knowing is self-validating, has already become selective in their compassion because knowing reveals where compassion will be effective and where it will be consumed, has already begun seeing patterns as architecture because knowing perceives structure rather than surface, has already gone quiet because knowing doesn't need to be spoken, has already lost interest in being right because knowing doesn't need confirmation, has already started grieving forward because knowing perceives temporal arcs that ordinary awareness can't see, has already started changing rooms with their presence because knowing radiates whether they intend it to or not. All 8 signs are really one sign, experienced from 8 different angles. The empath has crossed from sensitivity into wisdom, from feeling into knowing, from the empathic wound into the empathic gift in its highest form. And Jung would say this crossing isn't about the empath becoming something they weren't. It's about the empath finally becoming what they always were, before the world taught them to be afraid of their own perception. Now here's what Jung would want every empath hearing this to understand. The Sophia stage is not a destination you arrive at and then maintain effortlessly. It's a quality of consciousness that deepens the more you trust it and recedes the moment you start performing it. You can't announce that you've reached Sophia. You can't put it in your bio. The moment it becomes identity, I am a Sophia stage empath, the ego has co-opted it, and you've slipped back into a subtler version of the same old patterns. Sophia isn't something you claim. It's something you become transparent to. You don't achieve it. You stop obstructing it. Every defense mechanism you release, every shadow element you integrate, every false self you allow to die, these don't build Sophia. They remove the barriers that were preventing Sophia from operating through you all along. Jung was cautious about describing this stage because he understood how easily the ego could turn wisdom into costume. He'd watched patients touch genuine insight and immediately begin performing it, turning their breakthrough into a new persona rather than allowing it to dissolve all personas. The Sophia stage is fragile precisely because it's so powerful. The moment you grasp for it, you've lost it. The moment you try to demonstrate it, you've replaced it with its image. What protects the empath from this trap is the very suffering that brought them to Sophia in the first place. They've been through enough to know the difference between being and performing. They've been fooled enough, by others, by spiritual teachings, by their own ego, to recognize costume changes instantly, including their own. The depth of their wounding becomes the depth of their discernment. The years of being used for their empathy become the years that taught them when empathy is being requested genuinely versus when it's being harvested. This is what Jung meant by the wounded healer reaching their fullest expression. Not a healer who heals despite being wounded. A consciousness that has been made wise precisely by the wounds it has survived. The wounds weren't obstacles on the path to Sophia. They were the path. Every time the empath's sensitivity was exploited, every time their perception was denied, every time their boundaries were violated, every time they loved someone who couldn't love them back, those experiences were carving the vessel that Sophia would eventually fill. There's a grief in recognizing this, a grief that comes from understanding that all the pain was necessary. Not in a spiritual bypassing, everything happens for a reason way, in a structural way. The way a riverbed is carved by water that doesn't intend to create a channel, but can't help creating one by flowing. The empath didn't choose their suffering any more than the riverbed chose erosion. But the channel exists now. And what flows through it is wisdom so integrated, so embodied, so quiet and vast, that it barely resembles the reactive sensitivity that started the carving process. If you're in the middle of this transformation, and something in these words is resonating not as information but as recognition, as if you're being described rather than taught, that recognition itself is a sign. Sophia doesn't learn about herself through external sources, she remembers. And the feeling of remembering rather than learning is one of her most unmistakable signatures. Not every empath reaches this stage. Jung was honest about that. Many empaths spend their entire lives oscillating between absorption and exhaustion, between feeling everything and trying to feel nothing, between helping compulsively and collapsing from the cost of it. The Sophia stage requires a specific combination of suffering, psychological honesty, shadow integration, and the willingness to let every previous version of yourself die without knowing what comes next. That's a tall order. Most people understandably choose to stabilize at an earlier stage. There's no shame in that. Every stage of development has its own integrity. But for those who find themselves here, in this strange, quiet, seeing everything place where the old empathic patterns have burned away and something steadier has emerged in their absence, know that what you're experiencing has a name. It has a lineage. It has been recognized by one of the most sophisticated maps of human consciousness ever created. You're not losing your empathy. You're not becoming cold. You're not broken in some new way. You're entering the stage that Jung considered the highest expression of the inner feminine principle, the marriage of compassion and wisdom, feeling and knowing, depth of perception and absolute clarity. Sophia, the empath who finally became wise enough to hold their own power without being destroyed by it, without using it to rescue, without needing it to be recognized, without sacrificing themselves on the altar of everyone else's pain. If this is where you find yourself, the True Self-Discovery Guide was built for exactly this moment. 24 reflection exercises grounded in Jung's work, created not to teach you something new, but to give form to the knowing that's already alive in you. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.